Alrighty, good afternoon everyone. Fantastic to have you all here today, and I say fantastic to have you all here because we've been a little bit overwhelmed by this one. It's the our first webinar of the year, but we've got we've had 170 registrations for this webinar, which we were surprised about. We sort of thought that we might start with a topic that might just warm people up a bit and create a little bit of interest, but we've clearly hit a topic that that people are looking to take on some information about at the start of the school year, which is obviously how we set high expectation classrooms. A quick apology to people who got the email today and yesterday that had the old email text about the previous webinar around classroom management plan, so apologies for that one being in there. We're obviously getting used to that process of setting up our webinars and making sure that all the text is in the right place, and so apologies if you got the wrong email there, but we definitely are going to today talk about those high expectation environments that we want to create. And certainly, as I think the reason that so many people have registered is that people are cottoning on to the whole concept that if we don't establish those high expectations at the very start of the school year, whether it's with your homeroom or your pastoral care group, whichever phase of learning you're working in, that if we don't get it established straight away, then it's very difficult to change those expectations later on. So we want to give you some of those strategies while you're still warming up your classes for the start of the school year. And but more than that, I guess what we want to do is to give you some really important thinking. So if we can get you really thinking deeply about the ways that because it's quite a complicated beast how we establish high expectations. If it was as easy as just set the expectations, then none of you would feel any requirement at all to be here in this webinar. So it's quite a sophisticated beast, the whole idea of setting and then sustaining high expectations, and we have absolutely every intention of giving you as much thinking around that space that you can go and then do the contextualising around in, because we know that we've got people in the webinar today coming from all different, not only phases of learning, but all different socio-economic communities and all different locations geographically around Australia as well. So, look, I guess when we start off here, it's really important to let you know that what I'm not about to do today is to give you the 7 steps to being a highly effective setter of classroom expectations, because there are some key concepts that we need to keep in mind, but around every single one of those key concepts, there's a but. And I want to reassure you first of all that I didn't do the modelling for this slide, but it's a good reminder that the key things that we're going to work through today are all things to have in mind, but they all have limitations. There's a but about every single one of the key concepts we're going to work on today. So when it comes to establishing classroom rules, they can work pretty well. But there's a but, and it's about how many rules are going to be effective and engaged with by our people, and then it's also about what's our capacity to be able to enforce rules and to catch people when they do the wrong thing. There's also the whole concept around values, that values can work, but if we don't actually teach the behaviours that sit beneath those values and just hope that the values will work for us, then that's not a way to go about it. The values are too broad when they're left to stand alone, and we certainly can have some disagreement about what values actually mean anyway. Reminders can work. Regular reminders can work, but if there's no motivation for students to engage in a certain behaviour, then the reminders will fall on deaf ears. You'll hear me talk today very clearly, but I know that people are probably here today because they're thinking about where does the whole idea of consequences and or punishment fit within a model that establishes high expectations, and they can work, but they have to be meaningful and relevant, or students will rebel and push back against a system that comes up with arbitrary punishments. Even the idea of manipulating the environment and putting posters up about the expectations and the standards that we're setting for the classroom. Yep, that can work. But as we all know, there's certain signs we might drive past on our way to school every day that we've stopped seeing because they haven't changed. So the environment, putting a poster up alone won't do it. And I guess one of the other things that teachers are grappling with everywhere is the whole concept of whether rewards can work, and whether the place of extrinsic versus intrinsic rewards in setting high expectations, and what happens when we remove those rewards. Well, we're gonna have a really good look at that today as well, and exactly how it is that rewards can contribute to an environment that that sets and maintains really high levels of behaviour and conduct. Look, I guess that what I'm asking of you today is that we understand that there is some sophistication that's required here, that it's not as easy as being able to say, oh, the key is to establish classroom rules. Sure, we want to establish some rules, but there's always a sophistication and an understanding that needs to be qualified or conditioned against that concept of using rules. So I'm asking you to step up. If you think about your old Bloom's taxonomy, I'm very much asking you to step up and to get out of that whole idea that coming along today to just know, or the bottom of Bloom's, is not going to help us get anywhere. It's about how we apply, it's about how we design, it's about how we analyse, it's about how we evaluate, and that's very much at the top of the old Bloom's taxonomy there. So I want to encourage you to think at a really high level. I also want to acknowledge that encouraging you to think at a really high level about how you can set standards across your classroom for over a 12-month period, and learning about it within a less than 60-minute webinar is too much to ask as well. It's too huge a topic, and so what I'm going to do today is move incredibly quickly and give you as much information as I can under those key concepts and areas. But what I'm also going to do is show you at the end of the webinar a couple of ways that you might like to move forward more tangibly to support either yourself or to support your staff as we move forward. There's a couple of key little frames that I want us to keep in mind as we move forward here, and one of them is the whole concept that what we need to do here is to contextualise it in our schools. I really love this photo as just a reminder of whether you're a leader by position today or whether you're just in a position to influence others in your school through conversation. What we need to understand is that when it comes to setting high standards in our schools, that you alone will not achieve it. And so what we need to do is to be able to find opportunities for people to get together and to have high-level conversations around classroom practice and how we can create and how we can evaluate the practices that we're using. I absolutely love this picture. It's of some Italian teachers, and this is how they meet in their staff meeting, and it's they're very determined that nobody will sit in rows and nobody will have tables in front of them, because everything that they present in this staff meeting is about how we can, what's going to happen when we talk about it, how can we make sense of it, how can we do something creative with it. So I want to remind you that all the concepts today, I hope they're going to be incredibly valuable for you, but the way they actually take flight in your school is by sitting down and presenting them to your colleagues and having a really good conversation about how they'll be of impact in your environment, in your context, in your particular school and with the particular challenges that you have. All right, so that's a bit of framing up for the way that the day goes. In terms of the way that the webinar goes, I want to acknowledge that with 170 odd people today, that that there's every opportunity, every chance that we've got some newbies in the room. So welcome along. If this is your first Real Schools webinar, we want you to know that Real Schools webinars, while we record them, and we will be sending you after today a link that to the recording of it, so we want this to be a resource not just for the 60 minutes that we're together today, but well into the future as well. So we're going to send you the link to the recording of that webinar, but we want the people who are in the room today, people who are in the house today, to make sure that this is an interactive experience for us. We want you to know how you can do that. You will see your control panel on the screen, and we want you to know that your control panel has a hand up function as a starter, so you'll see a little hand there. And what happens is that when you put your hand up, we get an alert on our end that somebody has their hand up. So if I look through here now, I can see that Beth McMillan has her hand up. So Beth, I'm just going to give you a moment about whether you really want your hand up, whether you want to put your hand back down. That's absolutely fine if you want to put it back down. Well done, Beth. And if you put your hand up, it's because you think that something has bobbed up in the conversation that's worth making comment about. And if you do, the wonderful Chris, who's our business manager at Real Schools, is in the background. She's going to make sure that I am very aware that somebody has their hand up. And what I can do is unmute you, and you can actually ask that question, and we can get some, not only response from me, but we can get some response from the community of people that are in the room as well today. So there's that opportunity to interact. And as many people have also realised as well, that people like Angela and Marina and Zaynep and Mandy and Julie Julie Ann have already realised that there's a question box there. So question box is a great opportunity for you to be able to make a comment or a question that might be pertinent, one, to the content of the webinar today, and then secondly, if you are having any sort of technical difficulty or you're not quite sure how to use the control panel, then the amazing Chris will be in the background making sure that that we attend to you. So if you do put a question in there or you would like to make some sort of comment, then I'm gonna check in on those once or twice during the webinar. And more specifically, I've actually got a slide that puts a little stopper in and stops me from carrying on for too long towards right at the end of the webinar, where I'm going to revisit some of these questions and answer them, because the real work happens when we're when you're able to make sense of it and get a start in your workplace. So if it's a good concept, Adam, but what about when a kid does this? Then we're more than happy to chew on that as we go forward. So be aware of that. And be aware of also that we are recording the webinar. And that means that if you're a Real Schools member school, that webinar will be saved in the member section, and you'll have full access to that as we move forward. So for the next couple of moments, while we move into what we're really trying to do here, what we want to do is to get a really strong understanding of who is here today, and what your perspective is of the challenge that you have in your school. I really want to know what your role is, I guess. I want to do my differentiation about who it is that's in my classroom today. So what I'm going to do here is just to launch a quick poll, and it's going to give me an idea of the phase of learning that you're in. So I want you to have a look, just to for the majority of the people in your room, if you would, and just have a look at what those options are about whether you're in early childhood, whether you're in middle and upper primary, whether you're a middle years teacher. I know that there are some very specific challenges for middle years teachers around setting high expectation environments. Also want to know if you're a senior school. So a senior secondary teacher, with those setting standards for those VCE kids or those HSC kids is a real challenge sometimes, and also whether you're a school leader or whether you're a system leader or even whether you're in a student support or some other ancillary or supportive role in the school. Really want to know who the people are that we've got here today. I like to make sure that we get at least over 80%, so I've got a good cross-section there. I can see that we're pretty close now. So what I might do in just a couple of seconds is close that poll. That'll do us, I reckon. We'll close that poll and I'll share those results so everybody can see here who's in the room. So we can see we've actually got a fair spread today, so I'm going to try and stay reasonably broad. I can see that 45% of our people are teaching between years 7 and 12, so I'm paying attention to that today. But also we've got some people who are coming at this from how do we help people to be able to set expectations from that school and system leader area as well. And also a good spread of primary, above 30% of people in the room are primary teachers today as well. So we're going to make sure that we stay nice and broad. And what I'll do is trying to provide some examples that apply to both the secondary and the primary environment as we move forward. So I'm just going to hide those results. And then we go back to our slideshow. And then move forward to the next question that I have for you. The next question I have for you is I really want to know what it is that you're battling with, what it is that you're chewing on, what it is that you're trying to swallow, what's your motivation for being here today. So while I've got an understanding that there's a really good spread, I also want to know what is it that's really bugging you about trying it, what is it that's blocking you, what is it that's frustrating you about, what is it that you want to get better at, what's the reason that you've come here today. So the 5 options that I've got there are about how it is that we can define classroom standards, how it is that we can actually make them really clear to people, to the young people that we're working with. How is it that I can be tough about classroom standards without damaging relationships is another option that a lot of people grapple with. How is it that we can move on from our own defaults? I know that I have them. Anybody that's done restorative practices training with me, and I'll refer to that in a minute, will know full well that I have a default to the 2 box, and I want to know when I do that so that I can be proactive in the strategy. I want to know how to use rewards and consequences effectively. I want to know how they work and how they don't work. Or are you here today because you understand that sometimes you get a fantastic honeymoon period at the start of the year when everybody's really clued into the idea of being respectful, but that fades away as the year goes, and how it is that we can maintain and not just set those standards. Have a think about what's your main motivation for being here today. Thank you so much to all the people that are jumping on quickly and getting that voting going. I'm going to close that poll share those results with you as well. And it tells me that we've got a fair cross-section as well. So I do see that we've got a really strong focus here on people wanting to know how they can sustain, how they can maintain standards in the classroom once we get past that initial period where everything seems to be fantastic and kids that had bad habits have all of a sudden shed them at Christmas, but then they come creeping back in as we get into and out of February. And then there's that idea of how can I challenge behaviour, how can I be tough about setting these standards without damaging relationships, and I certainly want to make sure that we pay some attention there as well. So, if over half of the people in the room pick those two, then that's where I need to keep some attention as we move forward today. All right, that's in mind for me. Fabulous. I'll hide those results. Come back to the slideshow. Get away from our poor Egret here trying to eat more than he can chew. Let's get cracking. Today, like I said, I want to return. The place where I want to begin, I guess, is that whole notion of the restorative operating domains. And this is, this is for me my fundamental practice model. Models by nature should be really easy to reflect upon, and that's why I love this one, because it's only got 4 boxes, and any more than 4 boxes I start to really struggle with. And while I don't want to do the restorative practices pattern as we move for the restorative practices training for you today, what this is about is a balancing of firmness and fairness. And most of us look back on our time as educators, or not as educators, as students in the classroom, with fondness for the teachers who were both. We don't look back particularly fondly on the teachers who were incredibly firm with us at the sacrifice of fairness. In fact, we look at them as being the incredibly strict one, and I've had some people recently tell me, yes, I know what you're talking about, I went to school with nuns. So that's often the memory they have, is an incredible strictness or firmness or tendency to rules, boundaries, limits and expectations without the support required for us to step up and to reach those standards. We often don't remember our teachers who are overly fair and not particularly firm very well, and that's largely because you were too busy walking all over them. But what we do remember well are the teachers who built fantastic relationships with us, and they used those relationships to push us into higher levels of performance. So it's the teachers that had an incredibly high standard of us, but were also expected to go, also prepared to go above and beyond the call of duty to help us get there. So today, when we're talking about setting expectations, what we're on about here is very much the firm part of this model. We're talking about how is it that we can get those expectations in place, because one of the things that I have reflected strongly on around this model is that I believe that in normal circumstances there are times when we need to go to the 4 box for students where there's been something tragic happen and we need to layer on the support without actually folding in some expectations for a short period of time. But my firm belief is that in normal circumstances, improvement to behaviour will not happen in the bottom half of this model. So in the not box or the 4 box where expectations are low, I believe that behaviour does not improve in normal circumstances. It's only when we're up in the with box where we've got a really high level of expectation, and that's preferred, obviously, connected to a high level of support, but also in the 2 box, where if you don't want to work with us on this one, then that's okay. But what I'm not going to do is to compromise the standards that I have. And as the discomfort comes from the lack of fairness in our relationship, you might like to walk more comfortably over into the with box with us, because that's where everybody else is, and it's where they're really happily solving problems and achieving and feeling really fantastic in each other's company. So today is about that firm plane, and it's about what are the key things that we need to keep in mind when we're trying to set expectations that bring us up to the top half of this model. So the first one that I want to talk about, people often leap quite naturally, and this is a default that we all have, is to thinking about rules. When we're looking to establish expectations, what we're trying to do is to make sure that we have the right rules in place. And rules can be useful, but they have limitations also. And where we get ourselves into trouble with rules is where we're not selfish and selective enough about them. So what I mean by that is that I remember a Year 1 class that I worked with who established at the very start of the year a rule wall. So it was a long piece of butcher's paper down the wall and what the butcher's paper did was allow the students in the class to add rules as the class decided they needed them. And as you can probably imagine with Year 1 students, even though it started as a blank piece of butcher's paper, by the end of the year it was an incredibly long list of rules. I, in Term 4, was given the opportunity to engage with the kids and to see how this was working, and asked a couple of the students who had their backs to the rule wall, what's on the rule wall, and they couldn't tell me. Even though there were possibly 30 or 40 separate rules, they had no concept of what any of them were. And the reason is that we find it very difficult to remember large sets of rules. And so if we are going to use rules, then what we need to do is to allow ourselves only a small set of rules. But this is, to be honest, where I don't have a great deal of interest in negotiating what those, for instance, 3 rules might be. For me, I think you should be incredibly selfish around those rules. Sure, we want to engage our students, but we want to let them know, as we're establishing rules, what it is that you need to be able to lead and to be able to run a highly successful classroom. And we want those rules to be incredibly specific and very clear about the behaviours that we either wish to see or that we don't wish to see. And the reason we don't want to expand upon 3 is because when we get to higher levels, then what happens is not only do the students disengage like those Year 1 students, but the workload or the labour that's involved in changing behaviour through the enforcement of rules. And let's be really honest, when you enforce a rule, then what you usually do as a result of catching someone breaking the rule is to punish. What happens there is we have to get people to change their behaviour with any sort of consistency through the rule punishment cycle. We have to catch them every single time. So it's very labour intensive. A great example of that is AFL football. The picture you can see there of Sam Mitchell on the screen from the all-conquering Hawks. In AFL football, if you look at the history of AFL football, when they invented the sport, there were about 10 rules, and they're up on the wall at the MCG if you go and have a look as a little piece of history. And when they first invented it, how many umpires do you think they needed to be able to reinforce those rules, to enforce them through a rule punishment cycle? And the truth is that their answer was 0. They needed no umpires, and the reason was that the rules were so few that the captains could umpire the game, and they were so clear. The players then started to get better at the game, and what the players did was try to break the rules without getting caught by their own or the opposition's captain. So they decided they needed a few more rules, and as anyone who follows AFL football knows now, that the rule book of AFL football is just outrageously enormous, and to enforce such a large list of rules, there certainly isn't no umpires at a top level AFL game. In fact, there's 9. There's 3 on the field, there's 2 on the boundary, there's 2 running the goals, there's 1 on the video, and there's 1 emergency umpire as well, just in case one tears a calf. So there's an enormous amount of labour involved. In fact, 9 people full time on the job trying to enforce that rule book, and we don't have the time. You're not going to get an extra 8 umpires in the room to catch kids through rules doing the wrong thing. So what we want to do is to keep our rules very simple and to make sure that they're very limited in number. And if you can, make sure that they're very connected to your personal needs for what you need to have a classroom run successfully. Myself, for instance, I'm somebody who can handle noise, and on that I'm quite good with being able to have quite a noisy and a busy classroom. But some people can't concentrate when that's the case. And if you need to get very clear about the volume that you need in the classroom, no problem at all. Set a rule about it, stick to it, reinforce it, punish where you need to, and congratulate people when they meet that standard. Okay, so a little about rules. The next one I want to talk to you about is values. Values, I guess, are what has overtaken the whole concept of rules, and people are much more comfortable talking to them. And the reason that most of us are comfortable with them is probably 2 things. Number one reason that values work well for us is that they're broad, and many behaviours can be listed under the value of respect or responsibility, even excellence, even safety. Many behaviours can be demonstrated under that. That makes our values fraught also. It's a challenge to work under values, in that regard, because because they're so broad, we can sometimes have some disagreement about what the behaviours are that sit under those values. And the other reason that we like values is that they're often framed so positively. They feel comfortable. They feel like they're things that we want to do and that we want to make a poster about. And but what happens is that the challenge that we have around values is that often when we're introducing them at the start of the school year is we might say we have a respectful classroom. But the kids don't know what respect means. We want our students to behave responsibly, but we haven't yet taught what responsibility looks like in our classroom. So I often give the example of when I was a 15-year-old boy and my relationship with my mum. And in that relationship, if my mum had told me when I come home at the end of the school day that I needed to be responsible, then my definition of responsible would have been don't break anything. And provided I don't break anything, I can go outside and I can play cricket with my mate Brett. But the truth is that when what Mum meant by responsibility was something completely different, and what she wanted me to do was to unpack my bag, put my lunchbox in the kitchen, put my shoes next to my bag in my bedroom so that I could find them, not like the debacle that we had that morning. She wanted me to go into the backyard and mow the lawn, and she also then wanted me to come in and do half an hour of homework before I went and played cricket with Brett. And so what Mum was talking about there, what Mum was on about there is a completely different definition of responsibility. So we want to make sure that if we want our values to have any meaning, we need to actually start far more specifically than just talking about be responsible, be respectful, be excellent, be safe. We need to get very specific about what the behaviours are that in the classroom that are going to build us towards that, and we want to make sure that we teach them very explicitly, and that if we're going to make posters or we're going to make any sort of artefacts or icons about the things that we're going to that are going to contribute to having a respectful classroom, then they're very behavioural rather than very broad in the way that we work. So we just want to make sure that we are a little careful about values. They're terrific, but if we haven't taught the very specific sets of behaviours that are supposed to be in there, then we're always going to get some sort of disagreement about what it is to be respectful, responsible, excellent or safe. In terms of setting standards, people often leap to the idea that rewarding people for reaching a certain standard can be a really useful thing to do, and I tend to agree that it can be a very useful thing to do to reward people who are doing the right thing. But what we've got to do is make sure that we are using the right kind of rewards, and this is critically important. I find it amazing that we still have so many conversations in staff rooms around Australia about the value of extrinsic versus intrinsic rewards, and when the truth is that the research around rewards and the way that they work is pretty much in. We know how they work, and we know how they don't work. And so what we know about extrinsic rewards, as an example, is that extrinsic rewards are very valuable for bringing a target behaviour to attention. And they have to be differentiated, and what I mean by that is they have to be specific to individuals in your class, and they also have to be specific to the class working together as a group. So what I mean by that is that an extrinsic, anybody who's ever put a sticker on a Year 3 student who sits well on the floor will know the strange look they give you, as though, hang on a sec, what are you giving me a sticker for this for? I've been doing this for 3 years. But there are students sometimes in Year 3 who aren't very adept at being able to turn their attention in a very focused way to sitting on the floor quietly for any sort of sustained period of time. And an extrinsic reward for them might be a good idea to bring that behaviour to their attention. An extrinsic reward for somebody who's already developed some sort of mastery over that behaviour is going to be looked at quite foolishly, and in fact they'll think that you really don't know them particularly well anyway. We need to set a different behavioural target for those students, and to extrinsically reward them for reaching a target that they haven't yet achieved or developed some sort of mastery over. But as we know about extrinsic rewards is that they lose their effectiveness over time. They're good at bringing behaviour to attention, not so good for sustaining attention. So I have my 3 R's for extrinsic rewards, which is that at the start we do it regularly, and next we do it randomly, and then finally we do it rarely. So at the start, yes, you will be rewarded for demonstrating a particular target behaviour regularly, but after that it's just you're going to have to keep demonstrating the behaviour to get the reward, because it'll only happen every now and then towards the end it'll happen so rarely that it's kind of, we're hoping that at this point the intrinsic reward, the feeling that it's actually making my life work more effectively for me, is going to take over the need for the positive reward, the extrinsic reward that comes to them. I think about it in terms of I remember even as a principal instituting something that many schools have been trying, which is the whole idea of being positive and setting up systems like, you know, catching kids being good, catching kids doing the right thing. Instead of writing a slip or, you know, a ticket or whatever it is for students who do the wrong thing, we want to catch them doing the right thing. And I thought that was a really good idea. And what I said was to the students in my school that if you're caught being good, then you'll get a slip and you'll put it in the barrel. And after the first fortnight at assembly, we will draw out a ticket, and if it's a ticket from your class, then you get a pizza lunch. Everybody in your class will get pizza, and the kids were wildly motivated by that, and I thought it was fantastic. Kids running around everywhere trying to get caught doing the right thing. At the end of the first week, we had 570 tickets in the bin, and I thought that's a really great result, 570 different examples of kids doing the right thing at school. At the end of the second fortnight, there were 540, and I still thought, not bad, that's pretty good. And then at the end of the third fortnight, there were 270. It had actually cut in half. And what happened was that, you know, over time, extrinsic rewards lose their motivation, and the behaviour really hadn't improved over that period. What we need to do is to change not only the reward, but we need to change the very specific behaviour that reward was coming for. And the whole idea of being caught being good was certainly far too broad. I needed to be more specific about that. We also want to be really careful that when we're using rewards that we are using them in the right system. What I mean by that is that schools are constantly in this flux between competitive systems and collaborative systems, and this is where we get these whole ridiculous conversations about you know, ribbons at sports day, where we've got schools who are saying, no, we're not going to hand out ribbons on sports day because, you know, that'll make people feel bad. Well, the truth is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with handing out an extrinsic reward like a ribbon on a sports day in a competitive system. And when kids are running a race or they're in a tug of war, that is a competitive system. We need to be sophisticated enough to understand that in the classroom, that's a collaborative system. It's a place where people should be working together. And when we try to bring competitive elements into the classroom, and this is where I'd suggest even house points or tables points and things like that can cause issue, is that we might have the greatest intention. And we might say things like, we're going to have a focus for the next fortnight on kindness, and anybody who gets a kind act is going to get 5 points to their table, and people run around trying motivated by that extrinsic reward for 2 weeks, which is fantastic. We tally up the points at the end of 2 weeks, and the winning table jumps up and down and flips the bird at the table that came second, and we probably haven't done anything about kindness being an icon in our classroom. So we just want to be careful about bringing competitive systems into what should be a collaborative environment. We want students working together to achieve some sort of reward, and that's how we can actually have them encourage each other rather than try to defeat each other. That's where they actually see the benefits of these behaviours that we're going to change quite regularly as well. All right, moving on now to the whole concept of sanctions and penalties and punishments and where it all fits. The truth around, again, the research around punishments is in that punishments, what they do is they can often create some very negative thinking, and no behaviour changes without the thinking before it changing. So that's one of the things we need to get really clear about, is that we're not actually in the business of behaviour change, we're in the business of thinking change. And when we punish arbitrarily out of the blue because we've had enough, no, that's really bad. What happens is we create in our students a whole bunch of negative thinking. How is it that we could then punish or apply a consequence without creating the negative thinking? The best way is to make sure that the punishment is meaningful and relevant, and the best way to do that is to establish it ahead of time, and then the best way to establish it ahead of time is to engage the student in it. So this is for students who you identify as being, you know, what we call our frequent flyers, our repeat offenders. You don't need to do this for absolutely everybody, but what we do need to do for our repeat offenders is come up with some sort of individualised intervention. And what we want to do is say to them, you know, look, this has happened 3 times in the last 2 weeks. You know, what do you think should happen if we get to the 4th time that you hurt someone while you're in the yard? And often they'll come up with the kind of penalty we would. Often they'll come up with one that's far more harsh. And all we need to do is, for instance, write it down, put it aside, and then when that problem comes up, because, let's be honest, it probably will, when it comes up, all we need to do is to get that piece of paper out and say, hey, remember what we agreed last time, and we just need to follow through. And what happens is that you maximise their ability to think about their behaviour and reflect upon their behaviour. You preserve relationship. So for the people who at the start of the webinar today said they want to know how they can be tough without damaging relationship, what we need to do to apply consequences without damaging relationship is make sure that they are clearly known in advance, and even better if the student has had a say in what those consequences are. And again, not for everybody, just for your repeat offenders. Because what it does when we get them involved is it maximises, from a restorative point of view, the first principle of a fair process, which is engagement. It gets me involved. And in any classic perpetrator or victim type scenario where a student's made a poor behaviour choice, has not reached one of the high expectations that you have, what we want to do is to maximise their engagement. And the way we can do that with perpetrators is by going to them, and by going to them first and asking them what happened. We need to get them involved. Victims also want to be heard in this scenario, so we should never fall for the trap of, yes, I know what he's done, I can see what he's always doing this, isn't he? And I'm going to make sure that I'll take care of that for you, because that disengages them from the process. It leaves them out of it and reinforces their victim status. So what we want to do is engage them too, but we actually don't need to go to them first. They don't mind when we get to them. There's a difference between the way that perpetrators and victims want their engagement to happen. Perpetrators want it to happen first. Victims don't mind when you get to them, as long as you do. So the application of punishments or sanctions can be very useful, but if they come out of the blue because we've had enough, this is 4 times in the last 2 weeks, fine, that's 2 detentions. That's when we can expect people to push back against that system. And I guess one of the other points that I want to raise here, and I do thank so many people for coming to getting into the question boxes there and everything like that, and I want to make sure that I get into those and that I revisit those towards the end here today, as well as give people the opportunity to put their hand up too. I just want to have a bit of a chat on this whole concept of immersion as well, because people often think that, and they're right to think, that the environment is having a very direct impact on behaviour, and that's very true. And in fact, the University of London did some research recently about what impacts bullying in a positive way, and it was about number 6 or 7, I think it was, that the environment came in, improvements to the environment. When people are in a really positive environment, an environment that allows them to cooperate and work together and be together, then that works incredibly well, really effective. But so what we do sometimes in schools is we start to build signs and we put them up. Many of you would be familiar with the signs around programs like You Can Do It, but unfortunately many of you would also be familiar that there are signs, there are schools all over Australia that have put up the You Can Do It keys, but the keys have lost all meaning in the school. So putting the signs up is not nearly enough. In fact, when it comes to the environment, what we know about a stimulating environment is that the changeability of that environment is incredibly important. If you think about yourself driving to work today, that if you drove past a billboard and if it's a billboard that hasn't changed in a long period of time, you're unlikely to look at it because you're so familiar with it. In fact, the research is that once you've seen a sign 7 times, that you stop seeing it. It becomes a wall again. In fact, you're more likely to notice, as you can see on the screen, a blank billboard than you are to notice the same billboard that you've driven past more than 7 times. I know that I remember talking to this around communication with a group of plumbers from the plumbers and electricians in Alice Springs, and what amazed me was that we were talking about signs, and then I walked into on a break, I walked into the men's toilet there and saw a sign that was sitting above the urinal in the men's toilet, and I wondered what this sign was all about, because there wasn't really much text on there at all, and it was a colour chart. And in the heat in Alice Springs, what they were doing with the sign above the urinal was encouraging you to check your urine for your hydration level according to the colours on the chart. If you were in a certain range, they wanted you to go and drink another litre of water before you went back outside into the heat. And I thought this was fascinating, and I went back in to conduct the next session of the day and said to all of the plumbers and electricians, how we were talking about signs, a really great example is the one on your urinal, and every single big blokey plumber and electrician in that room looked at me and said, "What sign?" And the truth is that that sign had been there so long they'd stopped seeing it and stopped its relevance. So immersion theory, or placing people in an environment where that'll stimulate the right kind of behaviours. Number one is it's really important that the signs and the spaces that they use maximise positive affect and they minimise negative affect. So having a spaces like a chill out space or a quiet corner or a reading nook or something like that where kids can go and just let the emotion come out of a situation and calm down so that they can get back into their work is a positive thing to do. Not a problem at all having spaces like that available to you. But we also want to make sure that the spaces encourage structured cooperative opportunities to be together. We don't want to just focus on posters on the wall because we're going to need to change them regularly if that's what we want to do. But we want to make sure that if we are going to be manipulators of the environment, that let's create environments where kids can feel more positive than they were as a result of being, perhaps out in the yard beforehand. And then let's try to create spaces that encourage them to achieve together. Cooperative learning is one of the, I think, came in at about number 9 in the University of London's research into bullying prevention. So, and this was a study that went across 1,300 different schools. So it's a really high-level synthesis of what schools are doing to be able to get somewhere. And manipulation of the environment is something that we can get right, but if it's only just about putting a sign up about respect, then we're going to be limited in what impact that's going to have for us. And the last thing I want to do is just encourage you, I guess, around the whole concept of bringing all of these different concepts together in a really highly contextualised kind of way. All of punishment and immersion and rewards and values and rules have a place. It's just that we need to make sure that they come in the right quantities and that they come in the right condition. So it's a little bit like the ingredients that you might pick for a recipe. It's all well and good to have the right ingredients, but if we don't use them the right way, if we don't use signage the right way, if we don't use rules, if we don't use punishment, if we don't use rewards the right way, and those ingredients aren't fresh, then the whole recipe doesn't come together particularly well. And I really want to back you here. I want to say that take these key concepts around punishment, immersion, rewards, values, and rules, and do the baking, do the work required to contextualise it with the students that you have. You'll get the odd mistake, you'll get the odd burnt cake, but new strategies are like that. They're like, anytime you use a new strategy, we're likely to be met with some sort of resistance because the students are not going to know, where this came from, and try to resist the urge to say the well-trodden little bit of vocabulary that teachers are using around Australia that I really would love us to eradicate from our vocab completely. Try to avoid that temptation to say, I tried that and it didn't work. We need to stick at some well-thought-out strategy for a longer period of time than the first go. Let's be honest here, the old adversarial model that most of us went to school with, we've given it a good run. It's had about 150 to 200 years for it to work, and it hasn't. So we need to stick a little longer at some well-thought-out bits of strategy to be able to get somewhere. So even just to use that metaphor of cooking a little further, that you will every time you bake that cake, it's a slightly different product, and it doesn't mean that one's inferior to the next, but you're still refining your skill, you're developing mastery, and you're learning from the little mistakes and errors that you're making along the way. So feel free to experiment with these and to try to bring the right ingredients in the right quantity and in a most appropriate way. So look, like I said, I tried to go incredibly quickly to get through those concepts today. I do want to go now to the idea of some questions. So I want to encourage you that if you would like to put your hand up, you are more than welcome to do that now. We can unmute you and hear your question. I want to go to a couple of the questions that we've got in the question box already. And Jeremy's asked the blindingly obvious question here, which is blindingly obvious but incredibly pertinent, Jeremy, which is, how do you suggest we get parents on board with our expectations? I think that this is hugely important. I think that if there are teachers who are sending home a term letter, I was delighted to get an email. My daughter is in Year 10, and I was delighted to get an email from her teacher a couple of days before the school year started that was asking me if I, for a bit of a Q&A on who my daughter is and what she what motivates her to learn really well, and what are the personal things about her that we thought that she might need to know. But it also let us know this email what the standards are that he set for the classroom and what he believes about working with young people. I found it incredibly comforting that he would do that, and I think that in our communication home to parents a lot of the time, this runs across phases of learning. We make it operational. So what we don't want to do in primary schools is just make our letters home about what drinks they can bring to school, which day is library day, and what days they're allowed to wear their sports uniform. In secondary environments, we don't want to make it just about what the homework expectations are, and how they will be punished if they don't bring their library book back. What we want to do is let them know what our expectations are, what we believe about working with young people, and how we're going to make sure that they're aware of how we do those two big things that parents want to know about. They want to know how we're going to do teaching and learning, and they want to know how we're contributing to working together with them around citizen building. So let's write our communications and make our communications around those two things. And then I think that parents actually start to respect a little bit of our expertise when we share some of it in that way, and then they're more likely as a result to step into a meaningful relationship with us. Now that all sounds very big, Jeremy, and that's because it is. So I would suggest that any school that's looking to change model, and I want to tell you a little bit in just a few moments, Jeremy, about our next webinar for school leaders, which is about how we can change model. Whenever we're doing something as big as changing model, I think when it comes to parents, we don't need what I would traditionally call a communication plan. I think what we need is an over-communication plan. So I think that's really important. Okay, thank you very much for that question, Jeremy. Looking on here at Sue's questions. No, not Sue, sorry, Heather. Heather Saru. I'm just going to read your question out for a moment, Heather. How do you ensure that the kids own the rules if they are not directly involved in creating them? I would always include unpacking them so that the statements in our code of cooperation are well understood by all students. Tend to agree. And so what we've got to do here is walk a little fine line between one, I think, like I said at the start, when you're establishing rules, I don't think there's anything wrong with the teacher saying, this is what I need. I know that there's a fabulous teacher that I know of that says that everything in our classroom is negotiable, she says to the students, but just don't mess with me on these three things. This is what I need for our classroom to work incredibly well. So I don't think there's anything wrong with being able to negotiate with students what expectations might be. What I love to do, Heather, is to make sure that if we are going to talk about our values, then I love to talk to the students about getting them involved. So for instance, yes, we want to have a safe classroom. Could you guys sit in groups and could you come up with the three different ways, the three different very specific behaviours that safety will look like in our classroom? And we can do that about respect, we can do that about responsibility, and that maximises that first principle of a fair process that I mentioned before around engagement. So I think we can get them in by doing that, but I also think that it can be tempered by a teacher saying, you know what, I've got these couple of things here that I need you to stay firm with me on. It's when we let those couple of things become 10 things that students disengage from relationship with us. So incredibly pertinent question there. Thank you so much, Heather. Just looking here at Julianne's written, thanks for the common sense. Okay, I like to think that it's about common sense. Looking forward to insights and strategies that are about improving learning as well as student behaviour. I like to believe that if we can make the learning environment an incredibly safe, productive and cooperative one, that we will get that in return. I know that my experience was that as a principal of a school that when we introduced restorative practices as our fundamental way that we were going to do the citizen building stuff and how we were going to make the learning environment a more cohesive place, what we found was that our student learning, our mean scores in NAPLAN went up in 9 out of 10 categories. I remember our teachers were shattered that Year 5 writing dropped by a point and had to convince them that the overall view of the data was actually really good. We had improvements in student attendance as well, which we think contributed to that. So what we're doing here is saying this is culture building stuff, Julian. So this is about saying that if we build a culture in which our students are experiencing positive affect or positive feelings in the classroom, then what happens is that they engage at a higher level, and that means that our programs, our learning programs, have a greater opportunity to be effective as we move forward. So we've still got a little bit of question time here, so I'm just having a little look to just see if we've got any hands up at the moment. I think I might have got an alert about that, but Yep, I've got Mike, and no, Mike's put his hand back down. Oh, Mike, I nearly got you then. All right, so I'm just going to wait just for another little moment just to see if there's any other questions that are going to pop up in the question box there. Just looking here that people were really interested in getting in there. We've obviously got people's attention with the old plumber's crack at the start there. So, all right, look, I'll move on from there and just give you a couple of things that you might want to consider for your school moving forward. One is that we have, if this kind of information you think is useful and you think that particularly graduate or new teachers to your school might be able to benefit from this level of support, then we have a 12-month online program for those very teachers. It's a program where once a month we send them a really extensive and really specific video around a specific area of practice. We identify a local mentor in the school who can support that teacher, and we also make sure that they get it as a coaching component within this program too. So all of our teachers, and even our, for instance, our teachers at Roberts McCubbin Primary School here in Melbourne, the teachers that are in the fast track program, they're combining their coaching work together so that they get more access to it. And so we're going to do a couple of 2-hour sessions with those 4 teachers, which is fabulous for them. And so it's a program that supports them over a long period of time. We believe that for a graduate teacher or a new teacher or somebody who's just finding practice in the classroom a real challenge, that sending them to a one-off PD is and hoping that they will be in rapid ears fixed is a cruel and unfair thing to do. So what we want to do is to make that available to teachers all across Australia. We're getting some fabulous feedback about it. If you are interested in the teacher fast track, all I want you to do is just put in the question box, if you would just put in our TFT. If you just put the letters TFT in there, what we're going to do after the webinar today is track who writes TFT in the question box, and we're just going to send you the prospectus. No obligation or anything like that around that. We want to make sure that teachers in your school, get the support they need to get moving with the work that needs to happen between the 4 walls of the classroom. So if you put TFT in the box there, we're going to get that to you. And the last thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that we have a membership service at rural schools that sometimes I wonder how many people are fully aware of it, but what I do know is that our member schools and our partner schools are right into the member service. What happens is that once a month, if you sign up your school to be a member, it's a $249 commitment for an entire school community for 12 months. So we call it our no-brainer and our no-brainer product that we take to people in schools. And once a month, we're going to send you an article specifically around an area of teacher practice, and you can see from the ones on the screen that they have links to the 8SOL standards for teachers as well. And we also send an article around cultural leadership to everybody as well, so that's for the leaders in your school. Further, we send you a staff meeting conversation starter, which is a 3 to 4 minute video that you can use in your classrooms. In your staff rooms, to talk about practice and to keep that on the agenda when the school year becomes incredibly busy from an operational point of view. And we also store in our member section all of the previous webinars, all of the previous articles, all of the previous staff meeting conversation starters, all of the ebooks, and we sit them there like a library for you that you can go and steal. A great teacher friend of mine says that the great teaching is 90% theft, and we want to make sure that you've got something to thieve. So if membership is of interest to you, then we'll just in the question box there just pop the word member, and we're going to send you some information on that so that you can get your school involved in that and start receiving resources. You have full reproducible rights to those resources, so that means that you can go and download them, you can send them to teachers, you can put them in pigeonholes, you can send them home to parents, and if you want to make your school a member. So there's just a couple of little no-brainer ways that you might like to step forward from the kind of work we've been doing today. All right, I'm going to finish up there by reminding you to go and have a good look around the Rural Schools website. Stacks of info there, stacks of stuff that you can access, and a benefit to your school. I want to remind you that there's ways to get in touch. If you're sitting there today going, oh, I wouldn't mind having a chat about our school, getting into one of these partnerships that he's talking about, then just go and send us a quick email at info@ruralschools.com.au. We'll make an opportunity to either Skype into your school, phone into your school, come out and have a coffee and have a little bit of a yarn, and make sure that we're service in your school in the way that you want that to happen. And the last thing I want to do today is to remind you about our next webinar. We're going to run this one on Thursday the 17th of March. It's going to be at 3:30 p.m. and this is for school leaders, people who are both in current roles in school leadership and also people who are in aspiring or might be aspiring to be school leaders. I know that one of the conversations I have, to be honest, far too regularly with school leaders around Australia lately is about how we can move people past this whole punishment mindset and how it is that we can lead our school out of the consequences wilderness. So I wanted to bring that webinar to your attention. It's live now, and in the email that you'll get in a couple of days' time that'll have the recording of today's webinar, we're going to provide you with the link to be able to register for this one too, if that one's of interest to you. And if it's not, and you've got some school leaders in your school who would benefit from it, then feel free to make sure you spread the word. We want people to, every Real Schools webinar will always be free, and we want to make sure that all of you have the access to those. So I've got a couple of questions, a couple of opportunities left to finish off today. So I'm hoping we've still got most of our people left in the room. Mark Hugland, can I elaborate on collaborative rewards? What I mean by Mark, that's Mark down at Surfside Primary School in Torquay, so welcome along, Mark. What I mean by collaborative rewards is what we want is a situation in the classroom where if the students are going to work in any sort of competition, I always say that the competition should be about them working together to try and beat me, or together to try and reach a standard. So I've seen some fantastic systems where school teachers have had, for instance, the big marble maze through the classroom with big tubes of plastic running. If a student meets a certain standard or demonstrates a behavioural focus that they've got at the time, they can go and grab a marble, put it in the jar, and it goes all around to the ground, put it in the tube, and it flies around the room with great excitement and into a jar. And if we get to 30 bundles at the end of the week, then we get a reward together. So that's a reward that they get for doing something collaboratively, where we divide students into table groups. I know that I'm speaking to you, Mark, from a primary school perspective. When we divide students into table groups and ask them to demonstrate a certain behaviour to get points for their table, they tend to do it because they're trying to beat the other table, and that can often run counter to the very behaviour that we're looking for them to demonstrate. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the difference between competitive rewards and collaborative rewards. Fantastic question there again, as I would expect from you, Mark. Look, thank you so much to everybody that's put their information today. We're going to follow up with all of you. Thank you so much for putting your time aside to spend a little bit of time on how you can establish high standards. I hope it's been useful for you. Make sure you come along to Beyond Punishment. We really think this is going to be a bit of a groundbreaking one. And if you have any feedback on the webinar today, you are absolutely more than welcome to put that in the question mark box as well. We're always trying to refine these and make them better and help them hit the mark for you and your schools. Good luck. Have a fabulous February. We're going to see you in March. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.